We moved out at midnight. Stars shone over no man's land. A cool breath came off the dewy meadows. Mists shrouded the woods. We strode calmly into the beginning day, headed toward adventure, carried by our condition of strange readiness and a newly alerted courage. Pallid morning light lifted the contours from their slumbers. Green and reddish lights shimmered at the edge of the clouds, and profound silence lay over the roads and the men, marching in loose file. The sun burned. We slept in a sparse meadow. Scorched brown earth in ascending plateaus stretched out at our feet, thin brush and wizened grass, and on the horizon a sense of hills and hazy woods. I sensed the onset of a new phase of life, bitter and cruel. But my optimism transcended the future. Never had death been so plainly present. We marched into the tenebrous night. The noonday sun had dried the sweat on our brows, and now we were shivering and exhausted and footsore under a light dusting of rain. Thunderheads clashed over the tarmacked road. The torches of lightning lit up the shadowy land, and flares showed the front to the side of us. In Vizhegor we rested. The rain stopped, and we marched on. We slept for a few hours of the dull grey morning in a yurt, and then we were marching again along sandy tracks and red stone roads, sometimes reeling with exhaustion, toward Yarzevo. Rain showers alternated with piercing sun as now water, now sweat drenched us. No one thought of any marching order. Everyone just walked for himself and carried his rifle in the way he wanted to. The impression of torn boots and dirty uniforms was supplemented by sticks that we broke out of the hedges, and we rolled up our sleeves and tucked our forage caps into our belts. The sun bleached my hair and tanned our faces, which were hard and drawn with sweat and exertion. In Yarzevo we were put on trucks. Vehicles and guns were hurriedly made fast to flatbeds, and 13 of us were put on a goods wagon. The July sun scorched through the roof. Heat, the smells of the sweating horses, and their piss and shit produced an intolerable atmosphere. We opened both doors, but the air remained close, and the piercing ammoniac smell sat in our lungs like a lead lining. We all suffered from heart palpitations and headaches, and a few vomited. At night we froze in the draught that blew across the floor. All day I sat in the doorway breathing the rushing air, which, though thick with dust, humidity and heat, remained a blessing compared with the pestilential stink within. Villages and hills, endless cornfields, and the swampy forests of Bryansk flew by me. The corn was ripening. Some shocks stood in straight rows. Damp, mould, and resin blew in from the forests. Dust clouds danced on distant roads, and many streams had run dry. I felt strangely close to the earth. Like its trees and flowers, I felt my life blooming in this intoxicating summer. Like the grass and corn, it would soon sink back into harvest and decay. Mould and rot pierced the rising of the sap. The carrion of rotten boughs sustained the young growth, just as my corpse would one day sustain the seed. A feeling of security came over me. Life was large. There was no danger. It wasn't a question of the individual shrub or stalk. The weed flowered and suffered patiently in the circle of the seasons, and sleep and death would be followed by the new birth of the spring. I didn't need to worry. Dying was easy. I was a soldier, a wanderer and adventurer in no man's land. Spiritually I was free, and free in the face of death, no more lost to life than the blossom, fruit and seed of the rowan tree. We were set down in Berezovka. A baking heat scorched the land. Thirst tormented us along the march. The water in the streams and ponds was lukewarm and barely cooled our pulses. We drank it anyway, and no one fell ill. We strode through gold-gleaming country. In the villages we saw women and girls in colourful costumes, with headscarves and skirts in fiery red stitching on the white bodices over their heavy breasts, wide hips in an animal gait. In their carved, almost slitty-eyed faces, the cheekbones were prominent. Black ribbons of hair fell across low foreheads. We met few men, mostly oldsters in picturesque rags. White beards, white hair framed their weathered features. We exchanged bread and salt for milk, which we drank as avidly as fever patients, paused briefly in exhaustion, and washed the sweat off us with well water. In the next villages we found houses wrecked by shells, cratered roads, saw far-off clouds of smoke, and heard the distant, confused hubbub of a battle. From the direction of Orel, alarmed old women and children peered out of their windows and shrieked when they saw our guns. They were afraid we were bringing the war back to their huts. With handfuls of salt, we bought their friendship and their trust. They told us about the sudden appearance of the Red Army and the German counterthrust, and watched us go with frightened eyes. We moved on. Ravaged gardens, trampled fields lay beside our road. A forest took us in, and we were grateful for its thin shade, cooling damp under oaks and beeches, and the broken light in a clump of pines. We rested. I went looking for raspberries in the underbrush, found a type of moss I'd never seen by the seaside, stuck flowers in my forage cap and in the muzzle of my rifle. Ahead of us, in the blue-tinged forest, were the Russians. We marched along the country road, through meadows and swampy dells, where the occasional shell had landed. In a little hamlet between hedges and battered trees, the inhabitants were building a bunker next to their shot-up houses. I stopped to talk to a beautiful girl. In broken German, she told me how her siblings had died in the previous day's fighting. I kissed her and hurried to catch up to my comrades. The sun slipped down, and at twilight we reached a large village, clustered around a crumbling church. Long rows of cottages ran down from the hill into swampy valleys. Streams ran through the pastures. This was Mileyevo, our destination, the point at which the Russian breakthrough had been held. We were to occupy the neighbouring villages, make communication to north and south, and hold a new line. Dog-tired, we slept, with only a few sentries watching, and didn't know that it was only that self-same night that the Russians had withdrawn, no farther than the other end of the village. In the morning the battle started. Our troops advanced toward Panov, a village to the east of Mileyevo. Early in the morning the fighting began without any sort of preliminary bombardment. We were held in reserve, to secure the flank and follow with our anti-tank guns. Sporadic Russian artillery fire strafed the village and the front area. We waited behind the cover of some houses in light rain. I played with a kitten and listened to the far-off rifle fire and the bursts of machine gun fire till the order came to advance. So as not to expose the horses to danger, a column of us dragged the guns, hung with 4 crates of explosive shells, into position. Unobserved, we reached a hollow and traversed a creek. The water ran into our holy boots. Uphill. Our hands and arms were getting tired on the grips. Halfway up, intense shelling began and drove us off the path. We looked for cover in the furrows of a cornfield. There we lay behind the guns and smoked and listened to the nearby falling and bursting of the shells. I studied the filigree work of nature on the whiskers and kernels of an ear of wheat and blinked in the sun. Finally we dragged the guns farther away from the path to avoid the shelling, and found room to make further progress on an adjacent hill. Undisturbed, we reached our provisional goal. White flares flew up out of the woods. Our troops there seemed to have been making rapid progress. Now dense crowds of men spilled out of the forest. Our task seemed to have been done. Suddenly they spotted us and opened up on us with rapid, confused rifle fire. Only now did we make out the fleeing remnants of our attackers. Withdrawal. We dragged the guns down the hill on the double and wound up in a swamp. Then we dragged one cannon after another through it and up the steep-facing slope. The wheels sank in past the axles, while we were up to our knees in morass and water. Leaving ourselves only a short pause for breath, then, supported by stragglers, we pulled the guns farther up the hill. We were back in sight and range of the Russians, who were only a quarter of a mile behind us and closing rapidly. Our retreat turned into a flight. We fell ever farther behind with our loads. Desperately we launched a few explosive shells into the enemy ranks. Not much effect. We ditched the rest of the ammunition and panted on to Mileyevo. Our arms were exhausted, Our knees buckled, but there was no rest, no stopping to catch our breath. Machine gun bullets sprayed around us, smacked into the field, ripped open the ground at our feet. The first of us was felled, hit by a bullet in the heel. He crawled on, his face contorted with pain and dread. A second was hit in the head, a step away from me. We climbed over his body and didn't look back. Another man collapsed, screamed, clutched his hip, staggered up, crawled on a while and lay there. The fourth took a bullet in the chest. He gurgled for a while and stopped moving. Events moved past me as in a dream, mindlessly taken down. They had as little weight for me as the rain of bullets that now tore my tunic and one boot, as the nearing Russians, as all of life. With the last of our strength, we held on to the transom, while the blood pounded in our temples and our hearts raced. We knew no fear, we just pulled cannons. Then the horses raced up with the limbers, and we fixed the guns on them, threw ourselves on the beams and barrel, and raced into the village at a crazy gallop. There the two of us who had survived set up the gun and collapsed, dead tired, into the grass. Our lungs throbbed, the sweat dried to salty crusts on our twisted features. The last of our strength drained out of our arms and legs. Now dread flickered in our eyes. The images of the last few hours flared up briefly and submerged in our memories. We said the names of those who had died. I was staggering between dream and waking, saw everything through a veil, yet somehow with excessive clarity, as if I were unconscious and also overly aware. At that point, no enthusiasm, no foaming sense of life carried me along. Everything was quenched, will and fear, mind and soul. All that remained was a mechanically adaptable being that recorded events like a camera and was also at the end of its tether. The night began with a cloudburst. We cowered under canvas, but the water got through and drenched our tunics, even as the last of the sweat was drying in our undergarments. We froze and trembled, smoked with fingers numb with tiredness and misery in the July night. We wanted to stand guard together, but toward midnight we both dropped off, sitting on the transom till the light of morning woke us. We failed to register the danger. It wasn't giddiness. Perhaps it was the adventurer's trust in the stars. Faith in God or fatalism, submission or stubbornness. In our exhaustion, apathy knew no limits. In grey, windy morning cool, a violent bombardment of artillery, mortars and anti-tank weapons set in against our rifle pits and half-fortified positions. The Russian assault commenced. In broad waves and loose bands, the Russians emerged from their positions on the edge of the forest, a little over 900 yards in front of us, and advanced uprightly along the wide slope. Either side of the road there was tall, overripe corn. Only in the hollow did pasture land recommence. Defensive fire from infantry cannons punched the first holes in their ranks, but our artillery had no ammunition. Our explosive shells smashed into the enemy ranks. Machine guns beefed up the barrage, but the Russians pressed forward, apparently oblivious to their losses. The first of our wounded were ferried back. The dead were piling up in front of us, and the two of us remained by the gun. In front of us the attackers were bleeding to death, but to the side of us the last of the infantry who had been pulverized the day before were also dying. There the Russians succeeded in pushing deep into Milayevo. Toward noon the last of the enemy withdrew from the cornfield in front of us. We sent a few isolated shells after them. But either side of us the battle was raging. The communication was broken. We were on our own. We wiped the sweat from our gunpowder-blackened faces, had the sensation of dipping our hands in clay and dirt, listened to the sound of battle that was slowly drifting eastward. A runner turned up. There too, apparently, our reserves had succeeded in repulsing the Russians and holding the line. We stared at each other. Our uniforms had both been holed again, but we were intact. I burst out into wild sobbing. For a long time tears ran down my cheeks, washing white streaks in the layers of grime and soot. I vainly had recourse to cigarettes to calm myself, but it was an hour before I recovered. It wasn't the nearness of death, or the intense experience of danger, or the dreadfulness of the fighting. It was relief that caused me to break down, the fleeting awareness of the appalling things I had experienced, and that took the soul out of the mechanical action, so that it resumed its own uncertain being once more. Several heavy anti-tank guns now began to bombard our position with large-caliber shells. I lay in my hurriedly dug rifle pit and, in spite of the proximity of the crashing shells, soon fell asleep. I was awoken by an intensification of the firing and a hail of splinters. I saw the Russians emerging from the edge of the forest and ran to my gun. On the way, I was engulfed by a shower of earth from my hole, which had just taken a direct hit. A second between life and death. We lay behind the gun, not daring to get up and shoot, as the enemy fire was getting denser all the time, and machine guns also pinned us down. Our foolishness in remaining in a position familiar to the enemy became our doom. The Russians rapidly approached. Now it hardly mattered whether we lay there and were overrun and cut to pieces, or if we died in a desperate attempt at self-defence. We opened fire. There were not many still standing when the bluish-white clouds of powder from the shells drifted away. Our detonations crashed into the general noise. There was still the shrilling of incoming ordnance. A splinter scratched my hand. I let the blood flow and went on mechanically reloading. The few riflemen in front of us were either wounded or dead. The last of the machine guns fell silent, and 20 yards to the side of us the attackers emerged from the tall corn. There had been a gun of ours standing there. Maybe all the defenders were dead. I picked up my rifle. My comrade yanked the striker out of the lock without looking up and stuck it in his pocket. We fired off the last bullets and fled. A blow in the back felled me. I picked myself up, felt the blood trickling down my hip, threw away my rifle and belt, and hurried on. When I found myself among the few survivors, I stopped. We were the last. We had already been given up. I pulled my tunic away and jerked the splinter out. An adhesive plaster would have to do by way of bandage. I took a dead man's rifle and shoved ammunition in my pockets. We went over into counterattack, 30 men against an unknown number of enemy. Light artillery was wheeled up and turned to the side, where the Russians had penetrated even farther. We walked upright through the gardens, past dead and wounded, Germans and Russians. Blood dried on the corn. The sun plunged into night. Most of our little platoon had fallen. We got back to our gun and seconds later began firing. The last of the Russians fled past us. The battle was over. We watched among bodies, hour by hour. My wound hurt, but I was alive. The Russians didn't know how few of us there were when we risked our desperate counter, how few now returned dead tired to their holes, to lie and stare into the dark. The two of us stayed alone in our position. Reserves came. We were able to withdraw our gun to a reserve position. So doing, we passed the dead who had been brought together, fantastically illuminated by the light from a burning house and the torches of the flares. Reddish-brown bloodstains encrusted our uniforms. Black-red gouts of blood clung to shattered faces, hung on wild hair and punctured steel helmets. Clenched fists reached out pointlessly, casting menacing shadows. Detached limbs were laid alongside drained bodies. A solitary head grinned by a fence, two whose injuries were concealed by the dark faced each other in a spectral confrontation. In the sheen of the flames, dead eyes acquired a wild and mysterious life. A laughter produced by light and shade twitched around silent mouths, frozen in their death cries or a sardonic leer. A desperate stubbornness flickered about pressed lips. Other heads were no more than a mess of bone, blood, brain. Guts spilled out of ripped-open bellies. Silent soldiers stood around the motionless assembly. We folded our hands. The following day they were buried, and by the time the birch crosses were fixed over the mounds, no one knew any more if the name fitted the carrion beneath, where heat and worms were already getting to work, and that would soon put forth moss and grass. The Russian soil was quick to accept corpses of any description, those of her sons as much as those of others. But I was alive, and I had no fear of death as such. If I fell tomorrow, life would go on without me and my happiness or sorrow. I didn't need to worry about that. Thousands more were ready to work and to bring the task to completion, to quarrel with destiny and prevail, or, like me, fall by the wayside. I didn't matter, and as for whether I was given a grave or not, I wouldn't feel it in any case. At about midnight we moved farther back from the line, into the defile of a creek. We camouflaged our gun and finally slept for several hours. We awoke among dead Russians. The dead were all over the place, lying in the grass, on the path, in the stream, young, strong men with their weapons at their sides. They were the fallen of the day before. They were no longer our enemies, but still we were angry with them for soiling our drinking water. The sultry, thundery air favoured their decomposition, but we did at least wash, and after 2 days, eat, after a long time in which we had felt no hunger. I looked at myself in a mirror and got a fright. My brow was furrowed by 3 deep creases, sharp lines led down either side of my nose, and my mouth was white, all blood pressed out of it. I had seen and experienced death. Perhaps I would be marked by it as long as I lived. Stench and humidity lay over the defile. In the early dark, I set off on a scouting mission to explore the front and the condition of the land before us. I walked along a deserted village street. A dog followed me. A house cat wailed. Other than them, the place had died, its inhabitants fled. In some stalls I found starved animals. Weeds rampaged over the gardens. Ripe vegetables were rotting away. I climbed through fences and what remained of shot-up huts, walked on through rye and potato tops, my rifle at the ready. Evening dew was brushed onto my boots and cooled my hands. I never wore a steel helmet, and I'd covered my forage cap with cornflowers and ears of grain, at once ornament and camouflage. I wandered on into deeper darkness. The stars burned above me. No flares showed me where I was. I was deep into no man's land before a light went up, and I was shocked. An icy shudder gripped me. 3 Russians were lying only a few steps in front of me. I jerked my rifle up to my shoulder. They didn't budge. A breeze, cadaver smell. As though pursued by ghosts, I turned back, still unable to find any of our men, and was relieved to see the outlines of the village street in front of me again. I smoked a cigarette inside one of the houses. My comrades were calling me, and I joined up with them again. We brought the gun up a gentle slope and set it up in front of a garden. In the night, I stood sentry and listened to cannon thunder from north and south. In front of us all was quiet. Stars slid across the black sky, the Milky Way blinked, and after midnight the waning moon rose up out of cloudscape and gloom. Trees and shrubs stood there like ghosts in its sparse light. Grass smell wafted in the cool. No whiff of carrion in the air. No footfall, no voices. I kept still and watched, and nothing happened. The relief came. Then, like the corn and the shrubs and the dead, I slept. Early we moved into position by the Red Church in Mileyevo. The battle was raging in front of us. Russian artillery shot the church into a rubble of bricks, mortar and dust. Splinters flew around, the air pressure punched our lungs, but we remained unhurt. The fighting went on for 4 days, tank attacks failed, and dive bombers attacked the Russian positions. Then there was quiet. The front settled down, and our positions were strengthened by the remaining artillery pieces. We were moved to the southern entrance of Mileyevo. Close to the creek we found a good, clean house in a flourishing garden, and we made ourselves at home. In front of us a meadow with a few alders and poplars extended into the forest. We had no neighbours and only a few pillboxes between ourselves and the enemy. We, though, after the days of fighting, led a cheery and blithe life, roasted chickens and slaughtered a cow, fried potatoes and mixed cucumber salad, ate fresh carrots and played cards. After a brief shower, tropical heat began, and we spent the days lying naked in the creek. At night we were tormented by turnip fleas and bedbugs. Sleepless with the heat and the itching bites, we rolled around on our pallets and ended up sleeping in the open, till we woke up shivering in the dew and morning mist, with mosquitoes buzzing around us. We smeared flies on our bread and could barely defend ourselves. A storm softened the leaden atmosphere. Thick fog hid the landscape in the evening and didn't leave till it got dark. We kept watch while bullets whistled around us and smacked into the loose soil. During those nights, I felt a tingle of peril and adventure, like a form of electricity, an intensification of life that it takes war to provide. For even the wildest party or the boldest achievement in peacetime lacked the glamour of danger and the charm of proximity to death. My friend Hein had become close and dear to me. He was like fertile soil from which I grew. He worked with me and shaped me like soft wax. He gave meaning, order, and purpose to things. He firmed up what was real and scattered lies and illusions like chaff and didn't alarm me. I didn't run from him, yet I loved my life as deeply and passionately as never before. When the evening sky grew dark, the horizon continued to glimmer from the many fires. Village after village was sinking into rubble and ash. The people were driven west, their animals led away or slaughtered, the harvest torched. An insatiable work of destruction was readying the land for our departure. Roads and tracks around Milejevo were mined, bridges and houses booby-trapped. We waited for orders to leave. The nights poured with rain. Then a powerful sun came rampaging through the fog. Our last day in Milejevo. I dreamed of summers by the sea and finally took my leave of my girl. My destiny was enough to fill a life, and my vague yearnings vanished under presentiments of the adventures ahead. I was ready. Wandering into fall, 1943, departure. We strode silently off into the night, only the creaking of the carts on the sandy tracks and the whinnying of the horses joining the chirruping of the crickets. Fog ambled over fields and meadows, stars flashed up in the flimsy clouds, and the full moon doused houses, bushes, and trees in its milky gleam. The firelight of distant villages glimmered on the horizon and was reflected in the clouds. The retreat began. We marched. Far behind us we could hear the crash of the bridges being dynamited. Milejevo went up in flames. Barren no-man's land was left behind. We reached the tarmac road, collected ourselves, and got into defensive formation. We, with our easily manoeuvrable guns, made up the rear guard. We hurried westward through fresh, dewy pastures, following the line of fires, shivering in the night wind and tired. Before long the rapid march had us mopping our brows. We crossed the ruins of a village, Kvastovici, deserted streets, charred beams lying in the roadway. A dog howled at the moon. Stoves gaped from the ashes, and abandoned horses roved through the darkness like ghosts. In the midst of smoke and dying fires, we were fed. Dull orange daubed the smashed stoves, collapsed walls, and scorched vegetation. A smell of burning filled the air, and a fine rain of ashes descended on us. We moved off. Our eyes were falling shut, and we gripped hold of the cart, leaned against the guns. We were going uphill. We made a stop at the edge of an orchard. We parked the guns under ancient beeches. We were not permitted to sleep. To the east of us, Milejevo was ablaze. To the north, the dark, forbidding forests. In front of us, we could make out the outlines of the ravaged village against deeper darkness, struts, chimneys, fences among the smouldering wood. Death and destruction marked our path, our flight. We stood together, shivering in our coats, now struggling to stay awake, and now, with that strange alertness that comes out of extreme tiredness, talking in impassioned tones of indifferent subjects. We sang the wild, senseless songs of the period, songs of drink, adventures, and whores. And finally we started dancing clumsily, like bears, grotesque dream shapes in the Russian night. We were leading a ghost life, refugees dispersed across the immense land, and as we danced in Kvastovici, madness flickered around our foreheads, a dance on the ruins of the village as on the ruins of our lives, dazzled by flames, swaying in the wind like hanged corpses. Sluggish morning light seeped across the east. We found haystacks, spread out blankets, and slept till the sun rose and dangled over the devastation. With hot, fevered faces, with hurting limbs and swollen feet, we staggered on and were given a position to hold in a cornfield, facing the end of the village. There we lay down in the sparse shade of haystacks, tormented by heat and exhaustion, stung to bits by turnip fleas, feeling infinitely empty inside, and playing cards like sluggish, lifeless machines. We were degenerate, lousy, dirty, unprincipled, indifferent. We had long since lost all interest in life and the world. The Russians crossed Mileyevo and followed us along the tarmac road in long columns. We pulled back through deep sand into a defensive position. We went around barricades and minefields. The last abandoned houses of the village stood in ruinous gardens, themselves ruins. At the edge of the wood that had given us a little quiet and shade on the march out of Mileyevo into the catastrophe, we found waiting soldiers, sleeping beside their weapons, as though felled. We followed the road farther into the wood. Leaves and mould fermented in the midday heat. We disobeyed orders and rested. Overripe blueberries quenched our thirst. We came to the north flank, a line against unknown territory. The communication was broken. Our unit was all on its own. In the early evening we reached the edge of the forest. A chain of wooded hills surrounded us on all sides. We didn't know where we should point our guns. Apathetically, we threw ourselves down on the grass and slept until we were woken by cold and damp. The earth quickly gave up the fire of the day. We shivered, covered ourselves up in hay and twigs, and went back to sleep. Once woken up, we huddled closer together, smoked, and stared at the round moon. Finally, we heard some muffled voices, the clink of weapons and the clatter of vehicles, and we were back with the rear guard. In thick fog, our spectral column slid over endless pastures, and we followed the tarmac road in an accelerated march. The morning dispelled the fog. We reached the remnants of a village, left our guns in a ditch, and slept till we were woken, this time by hunger. It was evening. The wide plain was deathly still, and the evening star shone over the hills. A red flare went up steeply into the brighter air, shattered into a shower of stars, and went out. The Russians were attacking Buyanovici. In an endless chain we saw their black shapes approaching over the hills, slowly growing larger on the horizon. Shells screamed over our heads, detonating behind us with a crash. We saw their impacts, grey-black, whitish, yellow-brown clouds of gunpowder smoke, earth and dust, heard the crash, mingled with the hammering of machine guns. We did no shooting ourselves. Artillery and infantry shells smashed the waves of attackers, dispersed the survivors, and a Russian radio announcer gave orders to withdraw. This battle struck us as being like an eerie theatrical, and we didn't understand it. An order came for a speedy departure. Contact with the enemy broke off. We remained behind in the village as a rear guard. Angry and despairing, we left our guns limbered up and slept in the gutters. Not till early the next day did we move off, on the double, as in a frantic flight. Even so, the Russians were catching up. We fled with our horses, but the other guns, rendered unserviceable, were left to fall into enemy hands. We were marching west. We didn't know where we were going, and we didn't care. But the marching was demanding. So many sleepless nights took effect, hung like lead on our limbs. Our brows were fevered, our brains flickered with dazzlement and exhaustion. Now a heavy, unabating rain set in. The roads turned to swamp. Tarpaulins and coats gave no protection against so much water. We slithered, staggered, fell, picked ourselves up, and hurried on. The Russians were coming rapidly after us, and we were still wandering around in no man's land. At about noon we came to a village, Dubrova. The field kitchen was waiting for us with hot food, but it had turned rancid and inedible. The sun cut through the melting layer of clouds. Roads and meadows quickly dried, and we put up the gun in a stubble field between cornstalks and waited for it to get dark. Ahead of us, the hills stretched away in the brown-grey light. A few isolated shells exploded. The advanced posts withdrew, small as dwarfs in the implacable land. But the Russians did not press on. The dusk drew dim veils over hills, dales, and clumps of alder. The temperature fell. Behind us, Dubrova flickered in a series of rapidly spreading fires, like gold against the night sky. We strode behind the cart in the starless night. We were tormented by thirst. For days we had drunk hardly anything. But now, as we peered down into the wells, all ready to dip the buckets, we saw a scummy mass with rotten wood and thorn-apple bushes afloat on it. Other wells had been blown up, and the last blocked off by mines. Tears of rage and misery came to our eyes. What had been devised as a means of slowing the Russian advance had become a needless torture for us. We passed through smoke and flames. Beams crashed down from burning houses. Sparks whirled up in the air. Timber fires smouldered on the roadway. A rain of ashes and hot dust hailed down on us, coated our faces with a layer of grey, made our eyes water. Burning air blew at us and seared our lungs. Our throats contracted. Harsh flames dazzled us. Suddenly, planes roared overhead and dropped their bombs on our slow-marching columns. The cries of the wounded resounded into the bursting and whooshing of the flames. Horses broke loose and raced into the flames. Slowly we regrouped. I collected up field bottles and mess tins and hurried off ahead to look for water. An unknown soldier joined me. At the entrance to the village we discovered an undamaged well. We clambered over ruined walls, ashes, charred beams. I tumbled into a cellar, and my companion plunged on toward the well. A deafening detonation rang out. The air pressure sent me flying onto a pile of hot ashes. Earth and pieces of wood crashed down on top of me. I leaped up. The well was gone. I never saw the soldier again. A platoon from the rear guard suffered the same fate, and only one of them survived. I walked off into the gloom, all alone. Under a bridge I came upon a swampy puddle. Water. It tasted brackish, of algae, oil, and withered leaves. I drank it in thirsty gulps, filled the containers, and waited for my comrades. The roads got worse. In front of us, the forest rose like a black wall. Deep mud slowed us down. The exhausted, unwatered, and unfed horses reeled in the traces. We groped our way forward through the night. A late, pale moon rose over the treetops. Corduroy roads alternated with sand and boggy track. First-growth trees, birches, alders, and firs adjoined small clearings, patches of heather and moorland. We lost our way. We parked our guns and vehicles at the edge of a clearing, spread tarpaulins and blankets on the wet grass, and slept. The next morning we went on, and the march got a little easier in the blowing light. Then, once again, the sun burned over the leaves and twigs, dried the sweat on our brows, evaporated the dew, and turned the air to steam. We picked cranberries and cooled our hands in moss, moistened our wrists with swamp water, watered the horses, and finally went off the road altogether. We rested in the swampy forest at Bryansk and slept away the day. Evening. The rain drummed on the leaves, and impenetrable darkness spread everywhere. We travelled to our new position along narrow forest paths, past collapsed barns, until finally the tangle of trees lightened. In front of us was a plain with tall steppe grass, weeds, and bushes. The shallow trenches ran along the edge of the forest opposite. We couldn't see them. With damp hands we put up a tent in the rain and warmed up a few cans of food on the open fire. No sentries were posted. No one knew from where the Russians might be coming, whether there was danger or whether we were camped in the middle of no man's land. The next noon we returned to the resting place from the day before. We were not yet on call, but slowly the extent of the calamity at Orel began to dawn on us. We cursed that we were to be sacrificed for a bit of swampy woodland. We moved into a blockhouse. Unfinished timber walls supported a roof of fir branches, rushes and grass. We stuffed moss into the chinks, brought in grass and ferns to bed down on, lit a candle, and were finally able to write. State of alarm. We heard shots and their multiple echoes among the trees. A machine gun clattered into the branches over our heads. We dropped to the floor and listened. Eerie quiet. We undertook a scouting trip into the strange, perilous wood. Moonlight shone on the paths. Slimy, rotting wood glowed spectrally. Shadows danced menacingly in the wind. Drowsy bird calls rang out. A screech owl screamed into space. Bats flickered through the foliage. Twigs cracked. Fleeing deer crashed through the undergrowth. The night was full of noises and dangers. We stopped in a clearing, rifles at the ready, listened for a long time, and stared at the dimly illumined grass. Nothing but the night wind singing its monotonous song. The leaves rustled. Then we jumped. Shudders chased through us. Fleeing footfall, the cracking of branches, whispered conversation. We picked up a Russian word. We dived into the underbrush, stood back to back and watched. Our eyes hurt with tense looking, but nothing moved any more. The enemy was everywhere and nowhere. We went back. My palpitations eased, and before long I was asleep in the blockhouse, trusting to my good angel and my fate. The adventurer was well looked after. We made ourselves a little more comfortable. From our shelter we listened to the wind sing and the rain bash on the roof, collected berries by day, and stood at night leaning against tree trunks, shielded by bushes, and, as if one with them, watched perfectly still, staring into the dark or the moony depths of the forest, and slept uneasily, pursued by dreams. I read Rilke and Claudius, and at last I felt something like a yearning for my own life. Books, music, and peace. I collected mosses and lichens, swamp flowers and fallen leaves. Wasps and flies swarmed. Piratical hornets zoomed across the paths. In the evenings, the mosquitoes danced their complicated rounds in accordance with some obscure law. Under tall pines and beeches, firs and birches, rare oaks spread their crowns and established their Lebensraum. Alders, rowans, and sycamores struggled for light. Hazel thickets, willows, buckthorns lined clearings and paths. Under them grew ferns, raspberries, and reeds. Moss, heather, and lichen covered the ground. Small otters whisked through the grass. Ants travelled on invisible highways through rotten pine needles, last year's foliage, and humus. A smell of decomposition, rot, resin, and warm earth, of leaves, berries, and mouldering wood was carried on the soft breeze. Morels lurked in the gloom. Puffballs scattered their black dust, and fungi sat in the crooks of dead trees. Sometimes I would find a cadaver in the bushes, thick with flies, while burying beetles did their work on the underside. I was overcome with nausea. Sometimes I would lie there for hours on end, dreaming, watching a solitary moth, studying the sun flashing in the leaves, listening to the voices of the wood, thinking of summers of childhood and the magical woods of Darse. Here there was no pure joie de vivre, no unmixed beauty, no ravishing promenade. Everything was hostile and unfamiliar. The flowers and trees, earth and water, just like the whole immense country. It was oppressive, sad, silent, conducive to melancholy and gloom. It drained your soul and gave it back empty. I had no home here. I was just a guest, uninvited and tired. The spirits avoided me. Nothing spoke to me. And for all that, I thought I belonged here more than I did at home. It was a strange life I was living. Our position near Batogovo was given up in turn. An unfinished bunker was left behind. We moved out one moonless night. Darkness waved in the wood. Only above the broad road was there a slightly paler strip of sky, where stars sometimes appeared. Thick mud covered the tarmac road, interspersed with stretches of corduroy road, which made the horses' loads feel a little lighter. Hour upon hour we dragged ourselves through the morass, plunging into potholes, bashing into trees and branches that smacked across our sightless eyes. In the end, we let ourselves be dragged along by the vehicles. We were all done up. Morning broke with flying lights. A large clearing opened up. Plain, expanse of hills, endless forest on the horizon. Silvery light lay over the quiet landscape. The lingering coolness of the air was a memory of the night. In the fine haze, birches and firs rose by the roadside, magically beautiful, filigree work of great spirituality and distinction. My tiredness disappeared. I saw the muted play of colours before daybreak, the mild beauty of the shapes, and suddenly I was once more in love with life and drank in the splendour and beauty of the earth with grateful eyes. Wheresoever fate might move me, however difficult the time might be, however miserable existence might appear to be, as long as I could sate my gaze on the plenitude of wonders and listen to the thousand voices of Mother Earth, no single day was wasted. Every hour had its own secret meaning and value. Unforgettable images came to me and stilled the hunger of my spirit. Dreams filled in what duress had kept from being realized. Unconsidered things germinated, and great events awoke the slumbering spirit. I needed only to walk, and life was mine. Great impalpable life that, like a beautiful and terrible adventure, grew and, in the hazardousness of war, came to its full charm and loveliness, and filled me to bursting, but didn't surf it, enclosing me in the great circle of being and transformation, along with the grasses and the wild beasts. This hour before daybreak returned me to my affirmation and my amen, to my fate and to the whole world. I prayed that I might never lose it. The whole landscape filled with light. Every little leaf was gilded. Every blade of grass radiated warmth. I was proud of my perilous life, of everything I had survived and endured, collected and thought. To live life in its entirety, with all my senses and all my intellectual energy. Nothing else mattered. And for a long time my pride carried me through the arduous days. We rested. Then we marched through an idyllic landscape of villages and fields into the evening. I still dream of the pale green foliage of morning and the silvery grey birches in twilight. We passed Verki and put up our tents by the mill pond. We homeless men soon felt at home anywhere. Rain showers blew over us. The candle flickered in the draught. We read our letters, wrapped them in our wet blankets, and stood sentry in cloudburst and night. The next day the forest took us in again, lighter now in the mild September sun. On mud roads we marched through a glade at eventide. 2 hanged men swayed on a protruding branch. A musty smell of decomposition hung around their stiff forms. Their faces were swollen and bluish, contorted to grimaces. The flesh was coming away from the nails of their tied hands. Yellow-brown ichor dribbled out of their eyes and crusted on their cheeks, on which the stubble had continued to grow. One soldier took their picture. Another gave them a swing with his stick. Partisans. We laughed and moved off, along corduroy roads in the broad-leaved wood. Nightfall found us by the edge of the wood. We didn't know the positions and sent a couple of men out ahead as scouts. They were gone for many hours, missing. They never came back, and we found no trace of them. Stars shimmered through the birch tops. Night coolness drizzled down on us. We shivered with cold, hunger and fatigue, but no one dared sleep. I sat propped against a tree trunk and listened to the idle conversations. The voices softened, the words blurred to strange sounds. Fantasy wove her will-o'-the-wisp textures around things half understood. Snatches of dream melodies went by me, and then all was quiet. I awoke, alone, insouciantly fallen asleep in partisan country. I got a shock. With hurried strides I followed the path, looking for tracks of our vehicles, but without my rifle, which I'd left behind. It had barely grown lighter. An order had come through, and the others had forgotten about me. I caught up with them at the edge of the forest. The light vacillated in the east. Ahead of us the landscape climbed slowly. pasture land between dunes with exiled Mediterranean pines, sank into a valley, and rose on the opposite side with brown-singed heathland, steeply up to small conifer woods. That was where the Russians were. As it darkened, and in the cover afforded by some evening mist, we found some protective bushes and a half-made bunker. We concealed the gun and our wagon in the brush, spread out our blankets and slept, indifferent with tiredness, with no sentries, just behind the trench, on the road, like gypsies. Only the next morning did we find our designated position. It was among sand dunes near the front line. A young pinewood kept us out of sight, and there was a bunker there as well. We always had an undemanding home waiting for us, to live in and sleep in and one day to die in. We shared out the last of our tobacco and smoked cheerily. We had shelter against the weather, had pallets, a desk to write on, could set up our stove and no longer needed to freeze. And when wine and champagne were brought out in the evening, why then our cups were running over. The Russians attacked in the morning mist and soon sobered us up. A brief drum fire wrecked the trenches in the sand, and the attackers entered Pavlovka, a deserted village on the height next to us. Our infantry beat them back, and by midday all was quiet again. Quiet days passed. I wrote letters and sat reading in the sun, performed my tasks, gathering firewood and fetching water in no man's land, because the well there was nearer than the one behind our lines. Often we encountered Russian soldiers with buckets. Then we fired at them, a few bullets whistled past us, and we went back. After an hour, we undertook the unnecessary risk again and took hand grenades with us, but we didn't use them. It would be all too easy for the Russians to surround us and take us prisoner. A chance bullet could hit us. We didn't care. We challenged destiny, as if to force a decision for or against us and our lives, return or death. But all we did was cause unnecessary excitement, and we didn't take our secret hopes very seriously anymore. We weren't sure if we could live without the war and without Russia, even when a windy Sunday awoke my yearning for Darse, putting me in mind of love affairs and games on the beach. I still felt like an actor playing impossible parts. We were in a sort of berserk humour then. We mocked death and danger, distorted things, and drove all thoughts into the grotesque. Our scouting trips to the well became like boyish pranks, and we liked to annoy the Russians by parading our steel helmets over the rim of the trench. We dressed ourselves in comedy and irony, toyed with ridiculous turns of phrase, and came to depend on our silly hysterics. Under this mask, though, a tragedy went over. An inner calamity took its implacable course. I drifted into a spiritual vacuum. The last of my values collapsed. Goodness, nobility, beauty perished. My high spirits left me. The armour of apathy with which I had covered myself against terror, horror, fear, and madness, which had saved me from suffering and screaming, crushed any tender stirrings within me, snapped off the green shoots of hope, faith, and love of my fellow men, and turned my heart to stone. I was in decline, and I mocked myself for it. Often I was taken by a limitless sadness. I scrabbled through the debris of my youth and felt desperate that I couldn't get the ashes of my existence to burst into new flame. I strayed along the frontier, wiped out my memories of sea, music, and poetry, almost forgot my own name, and gave myself over to the shadows, the spectral existence of my mask, the mask of the laughing soldier. The wells were dry for a long time. It was a time of drought. Apostasy swallowed up my stars, and I rejected my God. I was shipwrecked by my fate, tossed onto a deserted shore with infinities ahead of me, the broken bridges of the past behind me, and, among 1,000 roads, not one to lead me home. Frost-candied meadows, woods, and hills didn't speak to me. I no longer understood their language. Only occasionally a wild yearning blazed up in me, and I was afraid that these wounds would never be healed. Not only paradise, but also hell was lost to us. Never had I felt myself so much of an adventurer in no man's land. Nothing new occurred. Everything was repetition. Danger and death, flight and wandering, fear, suffering, hope and loneliness, and plains, forests, fogs, and the heat of the sun. I had experienced them all so many, many times before. My life kept spiralling back to the same point. Emptiness and fullness alternated as formerly flood and ebb tide by the sea. At the beginning and ending of everything was the void. Nothing meant anything, not the war and not peace either. Freedom would never come, and a return home was just a dream. Mankind would continue to dance around work and bread, and even the ghostly dance of the fallen seemed to revolve around the golden calf. We, though, despised the men who stayed at home and hadn't experienced death, battle, and danger as we had, who hadn't put themselves through the worst, which was what made life so precious to us and often so shocking. There was a desperate pride in our position. At the same time, I bore in mind that I was fighting men I didn't hate, who were never enemies to me, who in their destiny were more like my brothers, and that I was only trying to perform an imposed duty, not unlike a monk serving strange idols, yet putting all his devotion and passion into his service and this order. What made us great wasn't what we did, but what we suffered. It was God's great game, and we had to be content to be figures in it. The world was wide, none of it went to waste. But the great life that was bred in war remained an illusion, a projection of death. In this way I wobbled between interpretations, seeing significance and contradiction, always in uncertainty and always in night. The forest position was vacated without a fight. We moved out in early moonlight and marched into hopelessness. It got cold. Fogs ghosted over the meadows, blew out of the trees with a dark, cavernous smell. In the distance, the flares of the rear guard went dazzling up. We lost our way in the foggy land. We struggled through streams, fields, and dense undergrowth toward higher ground, and after looking a long time, found a forest track that led us back to the tarmac road. Russian planes dropped phosphorus around us. The landscape was lit up bright as day, and we saw marching troops as far as anyone could see. Our horses got tired. We lagged behind. There was only darkness between us and the enemy. Silence surrounded us. We stopped and listened. I had an auditory hallucination of bells and ethereal music, and listened deeply. Like a bowl, I opened myself to the night, and the mysterious chiming filled me to the brim and flowed on out into the silent world. I suddenly gave a jump. The others weren't hearing anything. It was all going on inside me. We got to a bridge, ready to blow. With savage shouts, we succeeded in driving the horses across the river, dragged the guns ourselves, and pushed the wagons. A mine, laid by our sappers, blew up drovers, horses, and the first of the guns. We didn't care. We understood that no one was expecting us to get through. Given up, left to our own devices, we hastened through no man's land. Repeatedly, we stepped up the pace, even as our legs were quitting on us. Mortar fire blocked our way. We waited, but the Russians didn't charge. Then we bundled together the last of our strength and charged behind the bolting horses into a hail of iron, earth, and tree boughs. We reached the last bridge. Alarmed soldiers motioned to us to go back. The fuse was already lit. No one on the other side dared go up and put it out. We stampeded across, standing on limbers and carts, shouting and whipping the horses, and on the other side hurled ourselves to the ground. The explosion covered us with splinters and lumps of clay, tore the air from our lungs, and scattered the horses. No one was hurt. We soon managed to round up the exhausted animals, and in the first light we reached the outer line of defence, set up the guns in the frosty pasture land, found straw, and slept. We set off before it was evening. Tracks, roads, always straight ahead. As a rear guard, we paused in an incinerated village. Somewhere ahead of us was a base. That was all we knew. We carted planks and beams to the glowing embers of a house, stoked up a mighty fire, lay down in the hot ashes, and slept. No sentries watched over us. From time to time the cold awakened us, and we chucked fresh wood into the fire, stared into the flickering flames, wiped the dust and ashes off our haggard faces, and went to sleep again. Roused by the whinnying of the horses, we saw the last members of the rear guard creeping past and joined them. I felt unwell and lay down on the transom, fell asleep on the gun, and woke only as we were bouncing over fields and stopping in a clump of alders. We found a spring, drank the ice-cold water, and rested. In the evening, on the Bolva, we found only trenches and a fire site, no bunker. In a wood adjacent to a defile, we dug out a hole in the earth, laid tarpaulins over the entrance, and waited for vehicles to bring timber and brackets. Through a gap in the bushes, we saw the trench and a wide expanse of brown swampland in the fog, with the forest of Bryansk in the distance. That night the flares went both ways. We listened to the rumbling of tanks already having crossed the Bolva and unquietly waited for the day. At around noon, a sudden drumfire from tanks, mortars and artillery pieces began. It seemed to concentrate on the trenches and then brushed us in the hinterland. We huddled in our hole in the ground, barely protected. Splinters trickled down. Clouds and smoke and dust obscured our vision. A splinter struck me high on the temple. I saw the blood dripping into the sand, but was too excited to feel any pain. I got myself bandaged up and stayed with my taciturn comrades. No one dared look out. The Russians charged. We were in the focus of their mortar fire, listening to their unable to get to our gun, the path to which was open, and a chaotic scene of smoke and dust. A tank drove past us, and we retired to the end of the defile. The heavy weapons fire continued, machine guns hammered into it, and very nearby already, the short bursts of submachine guns. The scene resembled a boiling cauldron of sunshine, whirling clods of earth and gunpowder smoke. A couple of rifle shots next to me made me jump. A few paces behind me, a Russian collapsed. Others were creeping through the undergrowth. We leaped up and ran up the hill, through their wild firing and the occasional shell burst, one man with no boots, I with my gleaming white bandage. We caught our breath in a hollow for a few seconds. I was panting, my head seemed about to burst, my heart was banging away, but the Russians were still coming. We crossed a ridge, slowly, too exhausted to mind the danger. A few hundred yards to the side of us, we could see long lines of Russians attacking a little village, and in the distance we saw our infantry in full flight. We discussed what to do and decided to run the gauntlet of Russian fire. There was no other choice. Calmly we went on and climbed down into a narrow gorge, listened, pricked up our ears for the enemy, and lay on our bellies on the wet ground, cooled our faces and hands, and drank greedily. We pulled ourselves back up on bushes and thorns and saw the Russians leaving the village they had only just taken, withdrawing. The line ahead of us was occupied again. Only where we had left the gun there was a wide gap. It stood there untouched in the evening light. It was getting dark, and the five of us went over onto a counter-offensive. Once again we crossed the gorge and charged across the ridge. Machine guns forced us to the ground. One by one we leapt up, dropped to the ground again, and next to us the bullets smacked into the grass. We could feel the air pressure. We were waiting for darkness. With blood-curdling cries we threw ourselves upon our gun. A little later, reservists rolled up the trench and cleaned the area. I rode to the doctor, had my wound cleaned and dabbed with iodine, and returned to my comrades. The night was deathly still. In the morning we buried the dead man, a young Tatar, who was still clutching his submachine gun in his stiff hands. We made a hole next to the corpse, dragged him into it, and bent his stiff limbs till all of him went in. On his throat and chest we saw the dried blood of his wounds. When we moved him, his neck swung back. With a gurgle, a slime of blood and drool spilled out of his mouth. A stench rose, flies swerved around the body, and shuddering with nausea, we quickly closed up the hole. There wasn't time to give him a cross, just the tump of earth to indicate that a dead soldier lay there, fallen, so that we might live. But he haunted me for a long time to come. Marching orders. In frantic haste, we loaded the cart with ammunition and baggage, put the horses to, and marched. Marched. This was the way defeated troops marched, to avoid encirclement. We didn't know where we were going. We marched. We marched through moonlit forests, over endless roads, plains and hills, till the day dawned. Then we stopped to rest, slept among thistles and corn stooks, and in the dusk shot off the rest of our ammunition at a deserted village, just to lighten the carts a little. Ruined villages, debris and char marked our way. Behind us the last houses went up in flames, woods burned on the horizon, munitions dumps were blown up, and flares, shells and bombs went up like fireworks into the night sky. By our side were other columns, occasionally the populations of evacuated villages with their carts and animals, or else dragging their households on their backs. Old and young women, children, pregnant women, single men, barefoot in ripped shoes, with sacking wrapped around their feet. We overtook herds of cattle and sheep. An endless column stretched backward and forward, making all the time for the west. In some places the forest was already burning, a last barrier against the advancing Russians. The dawn burned like a planetary fire, with the terrible force of beauty. We got across the Desna. Our little band found itself in a great mass of fugitives. Women, prisoners and soldiers were working on positions that would surely fall into Russian hands the very next day. It started to rain and didn't stop. We marched and marched. The day passed. Night fell on muddy, churned-up roads. Still we marched on. We found 3 hours of sleep in a ravaged village. Onward. We set off again at midnight. Day brightened. Low hill country, expanse of swamps, meadows, fields and pastures. Very slowly the landscape altered its aspect. We barely took in the rich villages and their beauty in the last light of September. Our progress became a reeling, almost a crawling. We clung on to the cart, deposited rifles and bread sacks in it, let the trembling horses drag us forward, while our legs mechanically moved on. No more sleep the next night. One man shot himself out of despair and exhaustion. Others remained behind, disappeared. Some went on ahead on vehicles and were lost that way. Panic drove us on. Uncertainty choked us. Marching and marching. Late the next morning we got to Pochep to be put on trains. The Russians were still pressing. Pochep was due to be abandoned the very next day. We waited timorously at the end of our strength. We had covered more than 90 miles in 2 days and 3 nights. That was our flight. We waited to be entrained. Armoured cars, assault guns drove up the ramps. Trucks without engines, shot-up artillery pieces, useless tractors were loaded up, wedged tight and made fast, as train after train rolled westward. There was no room for us. The railwaymen were drunk. Train drivers and firemen slept on the tenders. We plundered the stores and canteens, loaded our cart with boxes of wine and spirits, looted tobacco and cigarettes, put on new uniforms, brought sweets, writing things, and soap out of the basements where the charges of dynamite had already been put down, and we started to drink. Most of it went bad, was destroyed, or fell into the hands of the victorious Russians. Carts full of planks, beams, coal and scrap iron were saved. We had to march. Our new destination was Unecha. We were in despair, marching and marching. Noonday sun burned down on dusty roads. We followed the tarmac. Then we mutinied. With not many comrades, I climbed onto a slowly moving truck. Other units melted away. Only the drivers remained with their horses. The rest of us got away. No orders were capable of keeping us exhausted men back, and the desire to live broke out in us once more. We rode, and we asked no questions. The wind cooled our brows, and not until evening did we jump off. Endless columns of motor vehicles were dragging west on the tarmac road. Heavily laden troops marched more slowly on the side roads. We rested by the roadside and looked on the map for the village of Starosely, where we were supposed to overnight. Slowly, 5 exhausted soldiers with bleeding and inflamed feet, we followed a track through grassy hills and peaceful fields into the evening. The cool and silent country was already asleep. Lights blinked in a village on a hill. A girl pointed us the way. It was getting dark by the time we saw the first, houses of Starosely. We ransacked them for eggs, butter and lard, oblivious to the amazement of the women and the men's mothers. We settled in one brightly lit room, drew the curtains, got the women to light a fire for us on the stove, to fix us supper. Reluctantly and slowly they obeyed, muttering to themselves. It was an odd feeling. We had no weapons. There were voices outside, whispering but excited. I drew my knife and went out. A group of young men were standing by the window, listening. They looked at me and asked in broken German if we meant to torch the village. No, but they didn't believe me. With heart pounding, I went out onto the street. It was night, dimly lit by a few stars and a pale crescent moon. Whistles sounded in the dark. Shouts rang out from the bushes. I went back inside and reported. 3 of my comrades crept through the garden, listened out, and caught the sounds of an excited meeting. All of them were young men with sticks and scythes, now setting off in the direction of our house. The 3 men hurried back and told us. We had already broken up the chairs and other furniture, and armed ourselves with clubs and metal bars, and taken our bayonets in our hands. Now we came charging out and hurled ourselves against the garden fence, crashed through it onto the grass, and raced down the hill. Shots rang out after us. We ran down the track and stopped only when we reached the bottom of the hill from which we had first seen the lights. In that village we found lodging, soldiers, and something to eat. Our sleep was uneasy, but the partisans didn't bother us. I was troubled by dreams of flight, imprisonment, and death. Earlier I would sometimes see only myself wandering in the foggy land, and the spice of adventure affected these fights and travels too. But now the demons chased me through torture and flight, and these dreams seemed not to end. Early in the morning we returned to the tarmac road. A truck took us along as far as Unecha. I sat on the fender in the wind, saw meadows and stubble fields slip by, woods, shrubs, and villages, and I felt a blissful intoxication. The adventure of being on the road, relying on myself, and free, the ride west, and my near escapes of the past night transported me into a mood of exuberant joie de vivre. A feeble sun lit the plain, the wind tugged at my hair, my cheeks and brows were seared by the air and dust. The experience of velocity was translated into an inner surge. For a few hours I was free, a drunken traveller in the unknown, a little closer to home, and I enjoyed my liberty like an opiate. I didn't feel like a soldier, but like a human being, a vagrant abroad in a wonderful world. The factories and storehouses of Unecha appeared behind thin trees, railway tracks, freight trains going by. In the evening we arrived, collected ourselves, and hooked up with other members of our platoon. More turned up all the time. We learned that some had already been put on trains in Clincy, and that onward transport was expected tomorrow. That evening we entrained. We weren't punished and barely scolded. Our comrades treated us to vodka and red wine. I have to say I missed my freedom and the adventurousness of being on the road. Slowly we headed toward Gomel, seeing always the same thing. Harvested fields in a storm, smoke clouds on the horizon. Russia was turning into a depopulated, smoking, burning, wreckage-strewn desert, and the war behind the front bothered me still more, because those it affected were non-combatants. I was partly responsible for this devastation and the grief it brought the people, responsible like all the nameless victims, like all the soldiers. I had almost forgotten that there was anything besides war and flight. I no longer dreamed of going home. Ahead of us a bridge had been blown up. The train stopped on the middle of the line in an endless chain of transports. Squads of sappers worked feverishly to rebuild the bridge. It wasn't quickly enough. Partisans took the villages around, the Red Army was approaching, and the last trains were already on the front line. Mortars shelled us, and we made ready to defend ourselves. Meanwhile, the travelling life continued. We ate up our booty from Pochep, broke into provision wagons and looted them, carried out boxes of sugar, wine, preserves and meat, spent the day roasting and boiling, and the different kitchens vied with one another as to who could make the best dishes. We wrote letters we weren't able to send and drank far into the night. We sang over claret and liqueurs, vodka and rum, plunged into intoxication like doomed men, talked drunkenly about sex and science, reeled by the railroad cars, sat outside over campfires, were made ill by the cheap spirits and the sudden rich diet, and carried on anyway, made grotesque speeches about war and peace, grew melancholy, talked about our lovelornness and homesickness, started laughing again, and went on drinking, whooped and skipped over the rails, danced in the cars, and fired into the air, made a Russian woman prisoner dance naked for us, greased her tits with boot polish, got her as drunk as we were, and sobered up only when we reached Gomel after 5 days. By order, the rest of the alcohol was destroyed. We rode via Zlobin, Mogilev and Orsha to Gorky. There we detrained. The flight was over. Now began the trench war to hold the line of the Dnieper. October sun decked the country in pallid gold. A cool wind blew over hills and fields. The grass yellowed. The blue air was redolent of damp earth, and a clear day passed. We were marching to the front. In the evening we rested in Andrichov. We lay around a fire of turf, wood and straw. Ominous-looking clouds gathered at nightfall, and the sun sank behind the gardens in an orgy of purple, cinnabar, crimson, violet and gold. The fire burned lower. We wrapped ourselves more tightly in our coats and put up our collars. Russian planes were bombing the village in phosphorescent light. We had many dead and wounded, and most of the horses were lost. But at midnight we set out. The darkness made it harder to find a way through the swampy hollows and over hills where the winter crop had begun to sprout. It was some time before the fires of Luki gave us a misty light to walk by. Hard behind the trench, after we had lost our way and in our exhaustion fallen asleep on the gun, we found a fire site and a hole in the ground to sleep in. We walked down the trench. Tarpaulins had been made fast to the walls, masking holes where a soldier might be asleep on thin straw. The night frost glittered on the ground. The sunny days brought with them a fresh wind and the evening's damp fog. The defenders often watched through the night here. Their guns rested in narrow rills. A small depression in the clay contained food, ammunition and smokes. There was one more base ahead of us. Calmly we carted up beams and boards, built us a bunker and slept, barely watched, while north of Lenino a battle was already raging and Russian storm troops appeared at night in front of our barbed wire. The front was quiet. We felt quiet as well. Time dribbled through our exhausted hands like sand. We could see no specks of gold in it. We were tormented by lice and scabies. We went off to be deloused and slathered ourselves with sulphur ointment. Not before time, we were given clean shirts. The ones we were wearing had gone black. And so we moved into our winter quarters. Drum fire ravaged the trenches and woke us from our tangled dreams. Shells from all sorts of weapons were going up, and their detonation, impact and whining approach made a single monotonous hurricane of noise. We threw ourselves into the deepest trenches. Earth and shrapnel struck our steel helmets. Even I replaced my forage cap. Only for seconds at a time did we dare look out into the fog-hung no-man's land. Nothing there stirred. Hours passed. The bombardment was unabating. We noticed we were at its focus. The Russians were already charging. Wave after wave of them flowed out into the valley and soon dipped out of our sight. We launched a few shells into the places where they were massed, plunged away from the gun, lay in wait, hazarded another race against death, all until night instituted a pause in hostilities. The Russians had broken through 1/2 mile to the side of us. It froze. Our temples. We pulled the gun into the gully, got help, and lugged it up the hill. A group of stragglers passed us, going back. The last. None spoke. The wheels dragged on the grass. A few shells whirred over our heads. We took a breather. A pair of us went back again. Slowly the Russian flares got closer. They were moving forward along a broad front into untenanted space. We stopped at our bunker. Muffled voices sounded somewhere, not near. It was a suicidal adventure. I lay down with my rifle, safety catch off, and my pistol in hand. My comrade fetched our bread sacks and packs, brought the blankets out. We made up our packs. The voices grew louder. They were very near now, and we could make out Russian words. We picked up our things and ran into the gully. Shouts and rapid fire from submachine guns followed us. Shadows, outlines loomed over the heights. A fireworks display of flares lit the scene as bright as day. We ran on, tumbled into craters and ditches, stumbled over dead, and finally got back to our new position. With a few more shells, the battle ended the next day. We were saved, or rather, we had been conditionally reprieved for an unknown period. Quiet days passed. There were the after-effects of terror. I kept seeing in front of me the wall of fire, smoke, earth and dust that we had lived and fought through. There was no escaping these visions, and whoever got away with his life would wear the burn scars of those hours as long as he lived. I had once again experienced the war in its full horror as an apotheosis of devastation and death. The blood dried in the clay and disappeared underfoot. The dead were buried. But after this experience, it wasn't possible for life to go on. No one who had been through this could ever be a human and a son of God any more. Yet things went on. They had to be borne and gotten over. My will to live reawakened. My resources of mind and spirit stirred once more, as though replenished from some mysterious source. I wiped those days and nights from my life, buried them deep, as though they had never been. I built a bridge across the chasm of that time and started a new life on the other side. We were found a calmer position. For a few days we had quiet behind the front. Once more we walked in fog and through the night. We hardly noticed one another. We were shadows, conducting spectral conversations and heading into the light. The air was heavy with moisture and cool, and the brassy music of the front rolled back to us. The night was without danger, and our position was good, a long way behind the firing trenches, a warm and fully built bunker. And there we moved in. A few rainy days went by. At the beginning of November it snowed for the first time. The howling gale drove the wet snow over the grass. Our stove was burning. We listened to the crackling of the wood as it crumbled and the humming of the wind. The snow on the hill melted before it got light. We grew quiet. A fire, a hut in the rainy country, were always there for the wanderer. God saw to the beasts of the field, and he gave us his tender blessings at the right time. Battles and death recurred, but there were pauses periodically as well. Out of danger and pain, new ore came to the soul, and it was up to us to smelt it first into steel and then into gold. Even if we buried the faithless stars in iron coffins, still we carried light within us. A village was on fire in the night, but the stars were quiet above the dancing flames. I was out and lost my way among the trenches. Without realizing it, I was wandering through no man's land, and I was close to the Russian trenches before the red tracer from enemy machine guns showed me the way back. But everything slipped by me with that dreamy mixture of objectivity and confusion that registers things like a mirror, but doesn't grasp them. Quiet. The quiet did us no good. We were still wired after the battle and needed activity, finding it only in brandy and card games. We listened to the primal song of the gale and pondered. In this damned time, it was the best thing to be a soldier, and at least stand squarely in the midst of this life. I felt in tune with my fate in a way I couldn't justify. I no longer sought to fend off the inevitable, did my duty with a certain pleasure, and was surprised at myself. The memory of music and poems made me aware of the grotesqueness of my soldier's life in Russia, like some inner laughter, and I guessed that with the next drum fire all this would burst like a soap bubble. But then the comedy acquired a deeper level. The war had become such an elemental planetary occurrence that everything else seemed fugitive, like froth and smoke, hoarfrost in the sunlight. Freedom, poesy, and song took up merely symbolic space, beyond reality. I had to be a soldier, inside as out, in order to exist in this reality of killing and dying. To keep a purchase on this ravaged earth, I had to die forlornly. That was what I thought when it was quiet and I couldn't fathom myself. Suddenly I yearned once more for mobility and travels into the unknown. It was like the return of hope and desire. I regained belief in my destiny. I found trust in life and youthful confidence and awaited whatever might come to pass with equanimity. I waited for adventure, and my secret desire was fulfilled. One dark, rainy night we moved out. We headed toward fresh calamities, privations, pains and adventures. In Koyuchao and Sukino we had lived almost as in peacetime. The turn of events could bring only bitter news. But I was pleased. I kept faith with my strange soldierliness. I might be an adventurer in no man's land, a shuttlecock of fate, but my inner self was in balance. The hopelessness of the war, the futility of my wanderings, the despair at any change, fear of the blessings of a return to home and peace, disgust at the insane crimes of humanity, all combined to make me see the last possibility of a completed life in death in Russia. So I moved out with confused spirits. We marched in a northwesterly direction. I gave myself to the melancholy beauty of autumnal landscapes. Rain fell, the tarmac turned to mud, freezing over at night and thawing out again by day. We crossed the Dnieper and found ourselves on the western bank of the river. Ahead of us was the roaring of the battle along the road from Smolensk to Minsk. No one knew where the road was taking us. It disappeared into infinity. At Buddy we spent the night in a barn. A gigantic stove was lit, but the wind came sweeping in. Stars flashed through the thatched roof and snow trickled in. We pulled on our winter gear, which was an improvement on the previous years, drank rum and champagne, slept a few hours, and set off to look for our postings in the gloaming. We got there in the dark, moved into a bunker, and slept in scraps, continually awoken by the fiendish concert of smoke projectors, surprise fire, and sentry duty. But the great battle was almost over. We captured a village and freed a platoon that had dug in there, waiting to be rescued or starved. There was no Russian counterthrust. It was only a few late skirmishes that we caught. The weather grew milder. We lay on pallets, sang songs in all kinds of languages, and got drunk every night. We forgot our worries and our lives. They were worth only a tired tossing away. New position. We marched back along the road. Rain showers brushed the land. We sang and walked, buzzy and optimistic on rum and champagne, and accepted the adventures ahead with an alcoholic equanimity. We were put on trains at Olustino, spent the night in a freight car over cards and wine, and got out at Staraya Bykov. We followed the road through mud, rain and snow, and recrossed the Dnieper. Like men condemned to drown, we stared at the water, measured its depth with apprehensive eyes, shivered and marched on, dully submissive to our fate, tired of war and the lot of being forever at the easternmost point on the front. We reached Selez, a village that had been recaptured only that morning. Russian bazookas and machine guns still lined the street, and the dead lay beside their weapons. We waited for night, huddled shivering around a fire, but it wasn't until morning that we moved off to our posts. We marched through a snowy wood, and stopping to rest once, I fell asleep under a bush. When I awoke, the others had moved off, having taken prisoner a few Russian stragglers who had surrendered after a few shots. We were approaching the main fighting line. Shells came out to greet us on the road. We found a wounded man, abandoned by his comrades. By twos we carried him into cover and bandaged him up while the tank shells crashed, and earth and shrapnel fell on top of us. His face was yellow, screaming, contorted by pain. The veins and sinews in his thigh were exposed, and his blood froze on our hands. He died. We chased after the others. In a blizzard black night, we put the gun into position. We found several earth holes in the vicinity, just wide and deep enough to take a pair of men lying on their sides. We put up tarpaulins over them, rolled ourselves into our blankets, and slept. No one on watch. The rain pattered down. It dripped into our holes. Thin snow covered the tarpaulins, was melted off by our breathing, and dribbled down the walls. We awoke in a puddle. Soaked and freezing, we staggered out into the fog. A mug of rum was all there was to eat or drink. A Russian shock troop charged and remained lying in the barrage, a long way from our guns. We built a bunker, laid a few boards over the top of it with some straw and sand, set up a stove, and dried out our blankets, coats, and uniforms all night. A brief drum fire from anti-tank guns and mortars brought us out. Dawn. Our infantry was running away. The Russians were charging down the slope ahead of us. We fired, stung by machine guns and grenades. I carried up the ammunition, saw the bullets plug into the snow in front of me. Mortar shells landed nearby. I didn't throw myself to the ground. I walked calmly and upright, as though nothing could happen to me. A counter-attack repulsed the attackers, but soon they were up at us again. We shot off the last of our shells and abandoned the position. The gun was lost. Calmly, by pairs, we walked to another gun half a mile away through machine gun fire and isolated rifle shots. It was a matter of such indifference whether we fell here or drowned on the flight across the Dnieper. We talked about Baudelaire. Sometimes we calmly lay down, waited for the firing to abate, and went on. It was a form of madness. The last man at the other gun was waiting for us. His face was bruised and swollen from flying clumps of earth. Cadavers lay around and the rain poured off them. Flesh and brains were stuck to the walls of a hut. Silently, we shook hands with the survivor. We posted no sentries. Amid rain and drifting snow, we fell asleep. Our own hut burned down, and we were able to rescue only our blankets and bread sacks from it. By the light of the flames, we built a bunker and tore down the beams from a barn. It was big and deep enough for us to sit and lie in. That night I lost my way and got back very late and depressed. The following day I was transferred to a different gun and found more good comrades. We were cheek by jowl, but our worlds were compatible. I had a sense of reawakening. Close to the trench was a little birch wood that contained our bunker. There was a glimmer of yellow from stubble fields under a blanket of white. Winter wheat pushed green spikes through the snow, and on the horizon, conifer forests framed the solemn, melancholy landscape under wintry yellow light. A persistent drizzle thawed out the ground. Bit by bit, our bunker collapsed. We propped up what was left. We didn't rebuild. We were waiting for the march back. We wanted to get across the Dnieper again. That became our obsession. The river crushed us, lamed our thoughts, and became a gloomy leitmotif in all our conversations. Sometimes we paid calls on other guns, huddled close in their holes, sang and argued the toss about war and peace, defeat and victory, and got drunk almost every night. I felt more like a soldier than ever, but like a warrior from some future empire, a secret intellectual process that was profoundly antipathetic to war. I wore my mask, as required by the time, and dreamed of a hermit life in a vine-grown monastery cell somewhere on the edge of the world, with the din of the world only distantly audible, and standing in some intimate relation to death, but quite different. Because even the medieval dance of death seemed merciful and beautiful compared with the bare cadaver, the corpse in no man's land, the living dead, like myself. I was no Christian, and I had no home anywhere outside this world. I drifted through my destiny like someone deracinated, condemned to wander. On all my uncertain travels, I was never able to lean against God as against some shady tree in an oasis. My only goal remained the hope for a better life in peacetime. It would begin the moment the door of my father's house closed behind me. But in the secret chambers of my heart, I no longer believed such a moment would ever come. This was my intellectual advent. That was what I thought on those days of preparation, and only sometimes did I understand. I was still young. The world was open to me, at least once I was back on the western bank of the Dnieper. It thawed and froze again. The landscape stiffened in frost, and when I stepped out of the bunker one night, it was the first time in a long time that I saw stars overhead. Stars, stars, stars. Snow sparkled, frost glittered, and profound silence lay over the earth. I was strangely happy in my gypsy life in the forest. In December, in the open air, a good friend to trees and clouds, the wind singing in the twigs, the smell of snow, resin, and forest floor wafted up. The pine-needled earth seemed warm even in winter. I need ask for nothing, worry for nothing, could dream and hearken undisturbed. This life rejoiced the adventurer in spite of himself, and the privations were not difficult for me. In the dusk, straw and hay fires burned in long rows on the opposite bank, silent signals as night fell. They reminded me of the lit-up towns on the other side of the river where I had been born. Even destruction could create magical pictures, and so, with my old fondness for paradox, I thought of war as an aesthetic problem. We marched up to the Dnieper Bridge, and then came the command to hold a strong point way in the east. In a mild blizzard, we crossed the Ukliast, a frozen swamp with few discernible paths, over man-made channels and pontoons into the unknown. Momoshino, our goal, was like an island. The moon burned down like iced fire. We lived on an island in no man's land. Momoshino, a totally obscure hamlet consisting of a few huts and barns, was made into a strongpoint. There was a trench dug around the village, studded with many machine-gun nests. Infantry artillery pieces and mortars stood between the huts, and we set up our cannons just behind the trench, camouflaged as a trash heap. We moved into a potato cellar. We unpacked, built ourselves pallets, a table and stools, installed a window and a stove, and felt we'd be here for a while. Ahead of us the land tumbled down a gully. On the other side rose a hill with tiny pines and sparse bushes. The Russians occupied their earth holes only at night. To the north, flares climbed behind the little witchy wood. There, somewhere, was the next strong point, between us, wood, moor, and flat plain. Irregular rifle fire rang out from distant hills. A Russian storm troop was on its way. Suddenly, searchlights came on opposite and combed the territory. Blindly, I plunged back into the dark. The front became restless. An hour later, heavy fire sounded from the north, from the direction of the Dnieper Bridge. We weren't surprised when orders came that we were moving to a new position. After midnight, we marched in bright moonlight to the road. Behind us, the bunker was burning down. The fire slowly receded as we left the enemy behind. No man's land all around. We passed through Selez. It had become a ghost village just behind the main fighting line, pocked by trenches and bunkers, and crisscrossed by the veins and intestines of war. Close to the Dnieper, we set up our gun on a hill at the edge of a pine wood. In front of us, a stream flowed through swampy, half-frozen pasture land. The wood was already in enemy hands. It didn't seem possible to escape. The river was too close. Exhausted, we wrapped ourselves in our blankets, lay down in the shelter of young pines on the soft pine-needle-sown ground, and slept. Next day we built a dugout, spread birch boughs over it, covered it with tarpaulins and hay, brought in straw to rest on, and set up the stove we took with us everywhere. We weren't able to sit in it, and the stove didn't generate much heat. But we had a roof, at least we were sheltered from snow and wind, and we slept well. We woke up with rheumatic pain, alarmed by shots, shouts, and cries for help. Our rear guard appeared at the edge of the wood, fled across the swamp, pursued by the Russians, until they found shelter next to us among the trees. We lobbed out some shells, laid down a machine gun barrage. For all their superior numbers, the enemy withdrew. In the grey, icy winter, we lived in the open air. In the pine wood, we were out of sight of the Russians. A bit of frozen snow still lay in the hollows, and we easily bore the cold. No one bothered with us. Only the field kitchen visited us at night, and so we were the only free men around at the time. Toughened and lazy, we let life do with us what it would. Note, gap in the manuscript, where the enemy's scout parties would rendezvous at night. The field kitchens would come up from the south in a sort of convoy, closely guarded under cover of darkness, and still there were always losses, wounded, killed, and often missing. The Russians took a lot of captives. They were no longer killing them, as they had once done at Mileyevo, and we, in daily expectation of such a fate, were now less worried about it. We were living on a sort of island in a Red Army sea. Sometimes the Russian scout parties would stroll through the village quite unmolested. Often there were little skirmishes. We were on alert day and night. The houses were vacated one by one, were hit by incendiaries or burned down, and even the new moon nights were bright with flames and distant conflagrations. So close to death, on the dividing line between a soldier's freedom and falling into enemy hands, I took to writing out my Russian adventures once more. Night after night. Outside, the sentry's footfall crunched on the snow, machine guns barked out, isolated shells whistled past. Russian nights, and I felt so much at home. Advent and Christmas passed. I stayed up, lived in my memories, and wrote. Some mornings I went to pick up mail and orders way in the hinterland. It was like visiting another island. Daybreak. I wandered silently in the foggy land, and the road was broad. Somewhere other grey-clad pilgrims were travelling into infinity. Overhead the stars were twinkling out. The road seemed to go on forever. Birch trees and conifer woods left ghostly intimations of themselves. All things had a wondrous form, but the landscape remained dead. Mute. Only the fog drifted. Deepest silence surrounded my tracks, as if I were somewhere in space. Behind me I heard voices, messages from the past, indescribably remote. But the wintry land came to life. Bushes and stars reached out their hands in friendship. Snowy light and fog disappeared. Morning air blew on me like God's breath. I was alone, and a melancholy sing-song chimed in me. The snow barely crunched underfoot. The wind played in my hair. I almost had to force myself to remember that there was a war on and that I was a soldier. I believed in my destiny once more, and in what was irreducibly human, some angelic force that was stronger than everything contrary, a sanctuary preserving whatever was best and most characteristic in me across the gulf of the years. Christmas passed like any other day. We drank a lot, but we didn't celebrate. The year fell back into God's hands. A new one came trundling out of the basket of eternity. Only dreams remained. Dreams of returning home and of peace. We were still living in the subterranean soldiers' town of Momoshino, and compared ourselves with those monks in India immured in magical temples and forests. Existence pressed in upon us and marked us. The soul built wall after wall around itself and concealed itself from the din of history. It was like a dream. It was true in some magical sense. Like sleepwalkers, we passed over the mystical bridge of life. But all around us we heard the grandeur and the decline of the West. Adventurers' blood pounded in our veins. Our curiosity about foreign parts was satisfied in abundance, and only homesickness remained true to us in the end. We moved out once more. The Russians had broken through. We could hear the sounds of a battle to the rear of us. We marched. We wandered through the smoke and flames of Momoshino. Fires were reflected in the snow. The night gleamed blood-red. We stopped at daybreak, and in the evening we moved into position in a wood near Malokrasnitsa. I became a runner and had more sleep and more time. A light conifer wood. We were near its edge, under continual fire from machine guns and shells. The Russians didn't attack, and one of our stormtroops got no farther than no man's land. The winter grew severe. Hoarfrost ornamented the trees like the soul of the twigs suddenly made visible. I loved the wood. The snow on fir and pine in golden sun, hoarfrost on full moon nights, and a baffling disquiet often sent me out at night. I loved life, winter, and danger. It was as though I were now bringing in the harvest of a long and productive time. I had become an adventurer, a wandering mendicant, a vagabond. The war sent me hither and thither like chaff. There seemed no end to my wanderings. But I loved life, winter, and peril. Whatever I lost was really gain. What I saw in loneliness and grief acquired a magical meaning. Whatever I had failed to do was completed, only bigger, and whatever I beheld struck me as being my own work. I stood there calmly. The earth fell into my open hands, and God was near to me. Time and eternity rushed past me. I loved life. Sleigh rides. I flew through the forest. The wind blew and soared in the branches, the horses panted, and the night became a dreamy, drunken revel. Frightened travellers jumped aside. A dusting of snow flew up. The runners creaked and crunched. A bold song was on my lips. Like clouds and stars, I chased through the sleeping land, plain, solitude, ravished by youth and speed. There was no end in sight. Yearning plunged into the distance. Frost caught in my hair, rushing passage as on a sleigh in space. An intoxicating feeling came over me, a burgeoning sense of life, the limitless, exuberant pleasure of being in the world. The freedom of an hour in the Russian winterland. I loved life. Years charged by, death wheeled over the earth, God and his stars perished in the west, and there was war on earth. I was a soldier in danger and in pain, a wanderer, a traveller in space. But I loved life. Pause. Pause. A furlough, a leave, home, home. But it was just an interval. The war went on. Once more I went out there. I loved life. The war began, and we saw God and his stars perish in the west. Death rampaged over the earth. He took off his mask, and his skull face grinned, chiselled with dementia and pain. We set out into no man's land, saw him dance in the distance, and heard the throb of his drums at night. And so he brought in his harvest of corn and tares. He transformed us with his being. He showed us other names and dimensions, and his dreams marked the picture of our time. His shadow fell across our path. His thoughts filled the spirit of the seeker, and sadness, suffering, and fear sprang up from the seed he had sown. Forced marches and dangers gave rise to adventure, but the conversation of the angels stopped at our graves. We, the nameless and the unknown, the solitary and the lover, the wise man and the fool, the rich and the poor, took up the fight with our destiny, and under the constellation of necessity we found a role for ourselves in resurrection and carrion, and decadence, hid my face from God, and finally found myself at home in the void, a speck of dust in space. Under my mask of intellectual exuberance, I lived like a ghost and sought refuge with whores and in wine. Fantasies of flight and deathly longings consumed me. I met my Beatrice. Love taught me to identify beauty in decline, greatness and purity in ruins, dignity and hope in suffering, and blessing, transformation, and mercy in death. A new life began. Like a convalescent, I heard the March winds rushing, and I experienced the spring awakening of the earth. When I had to say goodbye to my love, I put my trust in God and the stars again. The armies were waiting out by the west wall. I paid them no mind. Like a storm wave, the war burst in upon the Netherlands, and I experienced the defeat of the Dutch like a vision. My thoughts revolved around art and humanism. There was eternity in what peoples and individuals had created. Every age and time made their contribution to the edifice, and whoever had fulfilled his duty could die easy. Names might lose their ring, those who had borne them might disappear as the grave-digger mixed their corpses with earth and the wreckage of their works, but their spirits outlasted the ruins. Their souls lived in the destruction and in the memory of future generations. There was no death, and so the war came to touch my sense of life. But when France laid down her arms, my life went on as though nothing had happened. I went to the sea, to my favourite haunts on Das. I walked the beach in storm and sunshine. I lay on the dunes and dreamed to the crash of the waves, listened to the crickets strumming of hot noons while Pan slept. I sang and whiled away the hours. A stray love flitted along like a butterfly. I strolled through the woods, collected mosses, pine needles and leaves. Grasses and flowers were experiences for me. I looked for bison, listened to the sing-song of the wind, and watched the sun go down over the sea. The sky blazed in apocalyptic colours. Bronze and gold tumbled over the waves. I read on cool, starry nights and hurried through rain and storm. Still intoxicated by the richness of the earth, drunk with summer and youth, I returned to the city. Autumn gave me an induction in death and its various fruits. I loved it already, a sleep without dreams, the extinguishing of the candle, the sweet comfort of non-existence after the effort, the seeking and strangeness of living. In the confusion of my days, I yearned for its quiet, but I was afraid as well of death, which never took the veil off its reality, whose peace was alarming, whose silence droned like a primal storm, and whose mills churned night and day. It was winter again. I saw war and peace as mere intervals in the history of the world. I lost myself once more in endless nighttime conversations about the futility of life, the mask of God, the magic of the devil, and the tragedy of existence. I did my job by day and waited for the call-up to bring the turn in my destiny. But in my thoughts and dreams, my hopes, aspirations, and desires, I was still living without reference to the war, and death was a stranger to me and only an occasional visitor. I drifted like a shipwrecked sailor through the calms of fate. I was no longer a citizen of the world, and not yet a soldier. On my 21st birthday, I received my call-up for the beginning of February. I gave up my job, gathered together my manuscripts, locked away my diaries, and burned the fragments. Restless days without real activity dribbled between my fingers like sand. My bridges to the past broke. There was no path into the future, no star lit my way. Without hope, but not despairing either, tired and somehow feverish, I got through the emptiness of the waiting period. One night began like 1,000 others, but beneath its stars the change began. I dreamed of the threshold of a new life, and by morning I stood before my destiny as a different person. My mother was asleep. The night wind cried outside, showers of rain danced across the roofs, and my reading light burned with its friendly glow. I sat over blank pages, pondered and asked, dreamed and sought, wrestled with gods, angels, and demons, and understood. At first there was nothing but fear and foreboding. We stood at the gate to no man's land and felt the nearness of danger and pain. The years of darkness were beginning as the stars had decreed. Like beggars, we left behind the wreckage of our youth, freedom, love, mind, pleasure, and work. We were required to subject our own lives to the will of the age, and our destiny began like a tale of duress, patience, and death. We could not escape the law. There was a breach in our unfinished sense of the world, and like a dream, the march into the other and the unknown began, and all our paths ended in night. Nothing could be more antithetical to my nature than having to become a soldier, to be anonymous among strangers, a toy at the whim of commands and moods, than having to learn the use of weapons with which I would fight one day for a view of the world that was repugnant to me, in a war I never wanted, and against people who were not my enemies. Like a condemned man, I hesitated on the steps to the scaffold, and felt the sword graze my neck. The judge had broken the staff over me, and in my powerlessness I accepted his sentence. That was my abdication. I smoked, I wrote a line, I drained a glass of wine. The clock ticked, the light flickered along the spines of my books and on the piano. There were aromatic pine twigs in a vase, and Christ's thorn flowering. Hours dropped into the sea of time. The night advanced, and I kept my vigil, pondered and dreamed. The terror of the army years ahead left me no rest. I thought back on the last months of my own life. Like a hungry man facing a long period without food, I hastened through books, concerts, plays and parties, hectic youthful amours and thoughtful hours in the garden of youth. But that night music brought me no consolation, comedy no forgetting of self, tragic drama no reconciliation with my own fate. Every instance of beauty served only to heighten the pain of farewell, and even wine sharpened the anguish of my thoughts. I leafed through records, memoirs and accounts of the previous generation's world war, looking for a stance, a way to confront what could not be averted, to know what awaited me, and to understand the war, to learn my own part in it, and to force conflict, danger and death into my sense of the world. But my reading was as unavailing as my conversations with myself, and as every conversation with others, in the shade of melancholy and laughter. I switched off the light, pulled on my coat, and quietly closed the door after me, so as not to wake anyone. The cool night wind riffled through my hair. The moon was hidden behind the clouds, no streetlight lit my way, and there was no one abroad. I wandered through streets and lanes like a stray dog. Everything I passed carried associations of longing and adventure, despair and mania. I went home, and once more sat pondering in the ring of lamplight. Midnight came, and I was still up. In the beginning was suffering. We put down the masks we had worn in the early light, draped the mirrors of our being and of our vanity, renounced happiness and the growth of the soul, and took on the features of anonymity. We had the feeling. It had to be this way. We had a lot of past history to atone for. Now fate made us acquainted with the form of our repentance. We accepted it, like a monk the scourge. Under the mask of a soldier, we settled our debt, and to atone for past lives of deception, frivolity, and illusion, we consecrated ourselves to pain and danger. We were ready to suffer. Travel was not in my thoughts, any more than adventure, sowing seeds, or a secret maturation. The clock hands spun around. The hourglass scattered its sand. The distant roar of mines, mills, and ports beat against the window. Footfalls echoed away. The loving and the lost were all long since asleep. My room became an island in the cosmos. This was where the light burned for my solitary thinking, my questioning, and my guessing. The future was determined by the years ahead of soldiering. Our fate disentangles itself, and the form acquires definition in what is to come. We were looking for the future. We had a lot to offer and to desire, and now all streets led into life. Fate was something vague that had barely touched our friends, encounters, books, and dreams. As yet we were not marked by anything substantial, anything experienced and lived. But now pitiless life would shape us. We would ripen in denial, survive in hostility, and preserve what was ours in battle. War, the father of all things, was showing us the way. Questions and interpretations loomed in the distance, and we guessed at a good outcome. Our essence was ripening within us. Nothing divine could be taken from us, so long as we kept faith with our humanity. The man would emerge from the wearer of masks, being from appearance, and so would stand before God. I accepted the necessity of what lay ahead. I no longer saw my soldier's time as a cross to bear. I was all set to live. My mother awoke. She saw there was a light on in my room, and she came in and silently stroked my hair. Then I was once more on my own. I brought more wine, filled my glass, drank, and sighed heavily. I didn't want my years of destiny. All the powers and forces within me refused to allow the strange, the hostile, to enter. The future remained a hell, and my ascent did nothing to diminish my fear or struggle. Only my suffering and hoping helped. Nothing beautiful, lofty, or pure happened in no man's land. God did not dwell on battlefields, and the spirit as much as the body died in the trenches. Death held sway in war. What was best in me would be destroyed, and only what was rejected would moulder away. If I ever came home, then a different man, destroyed, marked for all time, someone transformed, would stand before the mirror. Then I would wear the brand of death and lead a ghostly existence with the dead in twilight and night. I emptied my glass. My head ached, my hands shook, my heart beat irregularly. The night was still blue and windy, and I found peace. Life would not permit of any no. Even the most terrible thing wanted to be sanctioned by an amen. I would have to learn to want destruction, to reject being indeed, as I had often done in word and thought, and in this way to give a grand affirmation to anything that might happen to me. I would have to become as the law decreed, to live or die as my star ordained. No refusal, no will, could change my destiny. Life would be lived whether I wanted or no. I just had to live it, to be it. I ate a piece of bread and lit a candle. In its flame I burned the pages I had covered that night. Then I opened the window and scattered the ashes outside. Dawn dimmed the stars. Day broke, and life went on. It came over me like an awakening. Dreams and images blew away. I looked to the light. Solitude was at an end. Numberless companions were on their way to me from all over the world. They were bearing torches, death's heads and banners, and their singing rushed into dawn and attack. Like a column of pilgrims, they were marching into the distance, and I, nameless, went with them. We had lost our masks, but our essence remained with us. Abroad, in life and suffering, our forms ripened, and in the immortal soul all travails, even on the brink of death, were turned to light. The spirit transformed things and appearances into new life. The ploughshare hurt in the fallow field of our souls. It was no longer a matter of happiness, sadness, life, death. Only fate made sense, and a man's mission. We grew and matured as necessity made us. The mills of suffering ground at the brittle crystal. The fire of warfare purified outlook and process, and death led us within ourselves. But we kept the face of God above us like stars. We lived life as it really was. And so I went to my recruiting inspection, as into a ceremonial advent. I became a soldier,